weird. And that's an interesting example of how a little program takes different pieces of content, put them together, and well, create something that sometimes seems meaningful, sometimes seems completely weird. Of course, Darius Kazemi, the guy behind this, is interested in this kind of weird humor that can appear when you combine those different things, and that's, I mean, that's part of like you have an entire field called weird Twitter. All those Twitter bots that create like strange content like this, which can be, well, you can feel that it's superficial, but it's an interesting exploration of how people using like development skills or design research skills try to investigate what it means when you have computer programs generating bits of cultures. There's another project he did that I find quite funny as well. It's called Trend Reports, and it's another bot that is quite weird that generates well, strange corporate PowerPoints like this. If you click, you would see this kind of well, images, and it's quite weird because all of this looks like a corporate PowerPoint, but it's all made up. It's a computer program that takes different words and terms, put them together, and it looks like a company would release something like this. Of course, there's some sort of absurdity. It feels absurd when you read that, but I think it's interesting. And if you look at this whole community of people developing those Twitter bots or talking about them, there's some strange sense of humor that is created and explored through technology. Does things like this. Millennials, their favorite things. Of course, it's absurd. It's only made up by the program that generate those forms. But I find that quite stimulating. One of the reasons of this is stimulating is that you can look at how it's coded, how it's programmed. If you go on GitHub, and I guess you're all familiar with GitHub. If you go on GitHub, you can look at the code and see what are the intentions of the developer or the designer or the artist behind those bots. You can try to understand what he meant, what he tried to explore, because the code is shared and if it's well documented, you might understand the logic. There's this journalist who did an interview of Darius Kazemi that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and that's how he explained what he's doing using those bots. It says that it sees his work as a way to expose the mechanics of automation by showing what happens in this kind of algorithmic production, generative production of cultural production. Of course, it's superficial, it's trivial, it's just weird tweets, but that's the starting point of something, and I'm going to go back to that later. And another argument, another thing that the journalist has discussed with this guy is the fact that it sees that as an attempt to educate people, to show them that when you have like generative cultural production, there's some mechanism in the background that is interesting to observe, because maybe in the future a lot of things would be functioning or would be like that. So that's a way to highlight, to expose, to show the logic of the machine. And one of the reasons this is important is that this logic of automating, of having software, computer programs, participating in everyday cultural production, that's a reality now. If you look at this is a project by the Institute of Network Culture in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, a project in which they investigated the role of bots on Wikipedia. I don't know if you're familiar about that, but Wikipedia, the collaborative encyclopedia, is not just not just made by humans. You have different computer programs that correct typos, adjust different things, the format of the articles, etc., etc. And in their research, they investigated different languages and the percentage of edits and changes made by bots on Wikipedia. I don't have the numbers in mind, but I think in English, on the English Wikipedia, it's like 20%, whereas in Swedish or in Basque, in languages which are far less used, the percentage of bots contributing to Wikipedia is quite important. Of course, it's not like editing big sentences and paragraphs. It's at this point, it could be adjusting dates. Like if someone dies, for instance, it could be correcting typos and stuff like that. But still, it's quite important. It's a sign, it's an indicator of the fact that computer programs participate in generating knowledge and culture. This is another project that I like about generating music based on Wikipedia edits. So it's two artists who created this very, very basic program that each time you have someone changing something on Wikipedia, it could be a bot changing something, it could be a human user changing something, it generates a sound. So that I can see that as a sort of weird mixture between what I was talking about before and, well, new forms of like cultural forms probably. And that's an interesting transition because it's not just limited to text. The Twitter bots, the logic of automation that you see on Twitter bots or on Wikipedia. There's some people creating music with that too. And I mentioned this project, but there are many others. It's just one among many. And that's also a project that we liked because well, we took the title of the book out of this project called Dadabots. It's a set of programs that extract automatically excerpts of music and put them together and put that then on SoundCloud. This kind of music. It's not completely random, of course. It's a sort of mix of different sources, different data sources, different kind of content. And it leads to this. Another interesting experiments about algorithmic culture is this project by this guy in, I think he's in Australia, who created a bot that generates music and put that music on a social media platform. What is interesting is that he also created another type of bots that listen to the tracks generated by his first bot, and he created some sort of business model out of that. He earned money by creating a bot that listened to the weird songs created by the other bots. So there's something strange and absurd in this. There was an article about that a few years ago, and I find it quite stimulating to think that there's bots and programs generating cultural forms, but there are also bots and programs listening. But is it really listening, or trying to do something out of that? And the absurdity of earning money in this kind of process makes it really, really weird. And that's maybe a common link between a lot of the projects I've selected. There's something strange and odd in the way they participate in everyday culture. Next project that is also stimulating is called Ghostwriter by Tromavin art collective based in Vienna, in Austria. It's a set of books, e-books, electronic books like this, which are based on a computer program called Ghostwriter that scrap content on YouTube comments. I think it's mostly about Justin Bieber and SpongeBob SquarePants. So of course it's absurd if you put them together, and it generates book covers and book content, and put that on Amazon as on the Amazon print-on-demand platform. So you can buy this lovely book called A Lot Was Being Hired for a few dollars. So I think here it's the Kindle edition, but there's also a print-on-demand edition. Well, of course, Amazon tries to get rid of that because they think it's spam content. If you see the kind of content that is in this book, it's funny, weird, and strange, but the logic is quite minimal. Of course, it's YouTube comments repackaged on a book. That's strange, that's for sure. But if you look at companies like Narrative Science, I don't know if you're familiar with Narrative Science. It's a company in the US which sells a computer program called Quill that can be used by companies or journalist companies like Forbes to generate articles. So if you go to Forbes and you're interested in finance, you would see things like this. This is a typical article. It's the author, it's Narrative Science, because that's the company who did the software that generated this article. And the reason why I show you this is that it's not, the mechanic behind that is not so different from the one you saw in the art project. There's something intriguing, there's something interesting in the way the Ghostwriter project that I presented before anticipates this kind of logic. I think Narrative Science sells this technology for financial journalism or sport journalism, which are, I don't mean here that the journalist could be replaced by the machine, but it's domains in which you have statistics, in which you have certain facts that could be transformed and repackaged by a computer program. Another example, that is stimulating along those lines is A Ship Adrift by James Bridle, the British artist. So James was interested by this boat, which was located on the south of the Thames in London, and he wanted to do a project with that. And the reason why he wanted to do that is because on the back of the boat there's this, and the boat is not moving, it's just like a fixed statue. But at the back of the boat there's this kind of meteorological set of sensors that can detect different things, like the wind, the force of the wind, the direction of the wind, etc. So what James did was to use the data collected by this and imagine how this boat could move around the world based on the actual wind. So what he did is to create this kind of web page in which every day when you go on this web page you would see the imagined movement of the boat depending on the wind, the force of the wind and the direction of the wind during the day. So on the first day it would go straight up north-west like this because the wind that day was in this direction. So as you go on the website every day you would see the movement. At the end of the trip it ended in Kazakhstan. But what is interesting here is that there's this part, like that's the movement, the map of the boat, but there's also those textual excerpts that are extracted by the computer program depending on the location, the virtual location of the boat. So every day there's a short bit of text that is based that is extracted from, I think it's Wikipedia entries, Foursquare comments, and something else that I don't remember. But that's text that is automatically extracted from existing databases and put on the website. So it's somehow the logbook of a crazy navigator who ends up in Kazakhstan. And I find that project interesting in the way it starts from existing data about the world, like the wind direction, the force of the wind, and create this strange story, so to say, based on those data with the map and the textual excerpts. The meaning of this is a bit unclear, of course, because it's text from different sources. But the fact that it's automated and it's based on this kind of locative or geolocative logic makes it quite interesting. So plenty of different examples. I chose I left aside a lot of other projects. But if we well, look at that by observing what happens, what is common between all of those projects, there are certain things that I'm quite interested in, and that we try to to describe with my colleague Joël. So, in order to understand what happens here, it's interesting to look at like new media and new media theory to understand the logic. So, and Manovich work could be helpful here. So if you read The Language of New Media, there's in Lev Manovich's work, there's this set of principles that describes how new media operates, and one of them is the fact that there's they're composed of digital code. There's some common code that is at the root of the of new media, and all the different examples I've shown are good examples of how, by sharing this encoded nature, those different bits of cultural forms can be assembled, modified, transformed, put together, and even sources from different type of data sources, like you're taking the force of the wind, maps, text from Wikipedia, text from YouTube comments. You put all that together and can create something which, I mean, the logic of the media makes it possible to create this kind of assemblage between the different pieces. Of course, that's not new. In the history of culture, there were many moments in which this kind of mixture has been theorized. I mentioned Dada at the beginning of the talk, but remix cultures. Here it's Lee Perry, the Jamaican reggae producer, was one of the pioneers of mixing different kind of music sources with this kind of result. This is back in '64, so it's reggae music mixed with a kid screaming. All of this done on a 4-track machine. But what is interesting here, and it's the same story of the surrealist with Dada. It's the idea of taking different cultural pieces and putting them together to create something new and original. And as technology evolved, like the scissors that allowed the beat poets to create cut-ups, this kind of music production machine, all of this participated somehow in creating those assemblage or this kind of remix of cultural forms. What is new too is, and here again it's Lev Manovich, what is new, I mean, compared to the remix culture from before, is the fact that different media from different media forms can now be combined. And if you, I mean, the project by James Bridle, the last project I've shown, is interesting about that. Because it's different data sources. There's map, there's something visual, there's data extracted from a meteorological sensor, there's text. All of this can be combined, creating this what Manovich called the media hybrid, and that's interesting because it helps to generate new opportunities, new cultural opportunities, using this kind of technology. The new thing is also the automation, and that's where the bot part or the computer program plays an important role. The fact that remix or the assemblage or like the mixture, the hybridization of cultural content can be automated by the computer program, and that's something that, well, it seems quite trivial to say it because we're used to that, but that's something that could not be done a long time ago. Another interesting concept in media theory that I find helpful here is this notion of remediation by Balter and Grusin. The fact that when you go from one media to another, well, the result is different. So if you do a remix, like Lee Perry on one machine, and then on another machine, the output should be different. So if you combine different data sources with a new computer program, there might be some remediations, there might be changes because it would inherit the logic of the machine. Maybe that's a bit abstract. So let's take an example. That's another project that I find quite stimulating here to understand the logic of what I discussed. It's called Generative Detective. It's made by a researcher called Greg Bornstein, working at the MIT Media Lab with in the Playful Systems group, and he did this sort of graphic novel, Generative Detective, by programming this piece of computer program that actually goes on Project Gutenberg. So Project Gutenberg is a database of open source content. It could be stories, it could be novels. So it extracts content from this from Project Gutenberg, mostly content about crimes, crime scenes, detectives. So it looks for those words and extract them. Then the computer program looks for pictures on Flickr, pictures that could be related to those topics, and import all of this content in processing, the programming in a script and processing, the programming language, applies this kind of black and white filter on the images, arrange the captions, and in the end you get this kind of graphic novel with a story composed by extracted bits of content from from Project Gutenberg and Flickr. And the project is discussed on GitHub. The code is explained, and the developer describes the logic, the difficulty, of course, he had to do that. But in the end, if you read the graphic novel, it actually makes sense. It's not as crazy as you would imagine. It's not as weird as the Ghostwriter project that I've presented. There's something that, well, there's some sort of connection between the different panels and the different images and the captions, and you can figure out the meaning of this. There's a story somehow in that. And the reason why I share this is that that's maybe one of the best examples of what I've presented, some sort of cultural forms in which computer programs generated by machines, programmed by humans, of course. It's one of those examples that shows that some sort of generative cultural forms can be produced, and it's not completely random, it's not completely weird, like the Ghostwriter example in which you have like Justin Bieber stuff mixed with SpongeBob SquarePants. Here there's something that you can recognize as an external observer, as something that has some sense in terms of cultural form. So, in terms of conclusion, why is that interesting? Why is that important? What I find intriguing here and what I find new and original in this, in all those examples that I've presented, in all those projects, art, design, experimental development project, what is interesting is that there's a similar logic. And the logic is that there are different data traces. It could be comments on YouTube, it could be, well, images on Flickr, something somewhere in the database. So you have data traces that can be seen as cultural elements, small cultural particles somehow, which could be transformed. I mentioned the remediation. I could have talked about glitches. Sometimes with technology, you have glitch that transform things. Those cultural elements might be changed. But what is interesting is that their hybridization, the fact that they could be combined, they could be assembled, can be automated, and this would lead to original assemblages. So this is a good example. It's different data traces, images, excerpts from text on Project Gutenberg. So one would say it's different cultural elements that are combined automatically by a computer program, and it leads to something well, there's something new in there. It's different from the stories that you had in Project Gutenberg. It's different from the images that you had on Flickr. So it's, yeah, there's some sort of originality in that. And if you look at anthropology, linguistics, and if you look at this kind of definition of cultural elements which could be hybridized and creating original assemblages, that's something that we already saw in history and anthropology. There's a term that is often used by linguists and anthropologists called creolization. This is an example of Caribbean cuisine that somehow works in a similar way. Different cultural elements that are assembled for, of course, for tragic reasons. Assemble and leads to something new, and the Caribbean cuisine is different from the different kind of cuisine which have been combined in order to do that. So what I'm interested in now is to investigate this kind of hypothesis, the fact that the way machines programmed by humans, the way that those machines and bots and programs play a role in cultural production, there's something that could be analyzed by these concepts, by creolization, for instance, coming from anthropology. That's an example of two quotes from two different thinkers in two different fields. You have Manovich, that I described a few minutes ago, that says something about this assemblage or this combination of different cultural forms. And you have Edouard Glissant, who's a famous thinker interested in creolization process. He's from the Caribbean, French Caribbean island, and he's been interested all his life in theorizing this kind of cultural process of hybridization that leads to new and original cultural forms. And if you read the two different definitions, and that's the reason why I put them together in the same slide here, there's something quite similar in the way they describe a similar phenomenon. Creolization, the actual definition by anthropologists or people like Glissant is the linguistic and cultural process that takes place when you have different cultural elements which are combined and create something new that did not exist before. So unexpected cultural forms. So what I'm interested in is how the digital technology, computer programs, computer bots, machines, can play a role into that. If there's some sort of, and that's the hypothesis, if there's some sort of machinic or digital creolization, the process by which the machine, like digital technologies, can foster or create those. Is that a new type of creolization? I don't know, but there's something similar in the anthropological process here. And that's basically what we try to describe in the book, with different examples, different projects, like the one I've described, interviews with artists, designers, and photographers, to try to investigate this, right? And it's still an ongoing process. We're still working on a different edition about that, but that's something that keeps me awake these days. So that's the end. Thank you. So I guess we have time for questions. Even if there's no question, we can talk. More music? That's 8-bit reggae music. It's people playing music with Game Boys, Commodore 64, and especially reggae music.
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a remark. It's like, for me, often, this is like you pointed out very often in multiple few moments that it's all made by human, the code. But this is like one of my basic critique of when people make computer-generated art in a wider sense, like, because in the end it's always, and this is my opinion on it, that artists tend to, or this
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
It's not a brush anymore. But, and there's like some, it's not like cheating, but it's like this has a pretending part to it. I don't know, maybe also this changed over time now, but and at the same time, like algorithms been in the discussions like for so many years now, and we can look at the arts, like how things are combined in a new way, and at the same time the algorithms which are used, and you also pointed this out, but in whatever, for Amazon or Google, like they do this like, or Facebook, on a
Mhm.
very high-tech level on the backside, what we can see, figuring out what we want. Like,
Yeah.
I parked my car at the mechanic here in Silver Lake, and I'm on Google Maps, and then I'm still on Google Maps, like I'm still fixed at the point,
Mhm.
and the advertising which pops up is like, here's the taxi company, like around the clock, because I already know
Yeah.
that I'm going to leave the car at the mechanic. And it's like, it's very simple, but this is like the algorithm. I mean, I think that's not maybe not
Mhm.
always the part which kind of already know this happens, but they collect so much information and algorithms. And it has like this playfulness, but it's very deep
Totally. Yeah.
in the lives today, and also it has like a dark side to it.
But what you said at the beginning is also important. I don't want to mean here that the machine does everything.
No,
It's
yeah,
it's
you mentioned that
yeah.
often, but I like to point that out
Yeah.
when people talk about,
Mm.
oh, look, the
Yeah.
computer made here. It's like,
No, it's more complicated than that. And I think those examples and
but it's the same attitude as Google was like advertised. They want to be invisible, right? It's
Mhm.
like it's just like the power plug on the wall you use and you don't think about it anymore. And oh yeah, the algorithm made that decision. Like we can't, like we have no, and that's not true, right? I
Mhm.
mean, there's people tweaking on it
yeah.
all the time.
And I mean, those examples are interesting because they show that it's much more complex than it's the machine culture. It's more than that. It could be pictures taken by a human, put on the Flickr. There could be a program designed by, of course, by another human. So all those examples, they, well, help us to see that the relationship between us and technologies is complex, and it's not just generative machines, it's thinking machines. All the fuss about the deep learning algorithm that this guy at Google used to create those dreaming machines, that's exactly the same intellectual trap. It's not, it's much more complicated than that. There's data sources that are fed into a machine, trained because it's a neural network, and it's not just a machine generating things out of the blue.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe kind of in response to Aaron's question a little bit, one thing that I guess that the way I'm thinking of it is also kind of an attempt to imitate a machine or an attempt to imitate a robotic art. So it is kind of hiding these kind of background processes, but I'm also thinking of people like, for example, I was obsessed with 4C books, which a ton of people were, because we thought it was
A robot, but it was a human.
some robot that was starting to become more human-like, right, and become a poet. And the story of that was really fascinating because it was a human. And I'm heavily involved in like bot culture to some degree. So like some of the projects like I've helped give feedback
Yeah.
on, like the comic book by Greg.
Yeah.
I helped direct him along with other people, many other people, like, hey, steer it to look this way
Yeah.
because it'll unify all these photos, for example. And I think partly there's an attempt at just fitting into human aesthetics what we think look good, which is the hidden part that you're talking about, Aaron, but also kind of an attempt to kind of follow a bot, like
Yeah.
what would bots see? What would, I mean, I know that's not really accurate, but like, I mean, partly you didn't cover like just like the plethora, the overabundance, which is actually what I find maybe most appealing about bot culture is like, for example, I have like Twitter bots that I check them every day, and they might post a few hundred things a day. I can't read it all.
Yeah.
It's too much. I actually think that's interesting. Like overabundance is actually what's special about kind of bot culture. And then I have a question for you, which is on the word creolization.
Yeah.
Not a word I had used connected to this work before. And I guess I don't understand what the difference or implications of that are compared to remix culture,
Yeah, it's maybe because I try to connect what I've presented with anthropology. I'm an ethnographer, so I try to find precedent in other sort of theories, and that's why I made this connection. Of course, you can use remix, which comes more from pop culture discourse, but I'm interested in, I mean, reading the theory about creolization alongside Manovich, for instance, or spending time like I do, like you, I mean, looking at the Twitter bots and reading about creolization makes this kind of, well, analysis make sense. So that's why I did that. And it's interesting because it seems like the cultural processes at stake in this already happen somehow in a different moment in history with other pieces of technology, and that's why I'm interested in that. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question based specifically also on your, well, the analogues that you draw between realization and digitization. Could you move back to the
Yeah.
Manovich quote, maybe?
I don't necessarily mean that they say the same thing. I mean that there's an analogy that is interesting to observe.
That I saw. I wondered about this last sentence of Manovich when he speaks about functioning
Mhm.
in a way. About this function, and I know that my question is actually one that many theorists say we should not ask anymore, and who claim that with more digital art we have been pushed beyond like hermeneutics and
Mhm.
traditional
Mhm.
hermeneutical questions are not the ones anymore that we should ask about this sort of thing. But having seen a word like dysfunction, I wonder how do you read this sort of works? Do you see them, for example, well, Dada itself and their sort of making assemblages or also creolization
Mhm.
have been very much read as like commons, societal commons. So what reading do you give of this sort of works that you've been presenting? Because saying that there are assemblages is not yet saying anything
No.
about what they do.
Well, it's tricky because of course they're done. Some are done as the context in which they're done is can be informative. Some are done as jokes, like some people having fun creating Twitter bots. Some others are more like explorations. So it's not. I mean, at this stage, it's mostly people playing with technology, so to say. But if you look at the narrative science example that I've presented, it's not so funny anymore because some journalists may lose their job. So I don't know at this point, but yeah. It's not that I'm not concerned, but I'm at this point I don't have a specific reading about that because it's a bit too soon to say from my perspective, of course. What I'm also concerned about is what new way. What does new means here? Because that's a bit tricky, and it implies that there's some sort of external observer that can decide whether things are new or different, and that's what I find is quite difficult from a cultural perspective. Of course, from a political perspective, it's like okay, there's some risk that this might have a very tremendous influence on how cultural forms and culture is produced. But is that, I mean, is culture just that? Maybe not. So hopefully there could be other things than that.
Yeah, because what interests me, since you also related so explicitly to this notion of culture,
Mm.
what strikes me in some of the works that you've shown is that they actually use like these big tokens or prototypes of traditional
Yes.
concepts like the encyclopedia and the library that have already been remediated
Yes.
in Wikipedia and
Yeah.
Gutenberg projects. And this is like the next remediation
Yeah.
of something that is already
Yeah.
remediated.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether you relate that to like media history or revolutions in media, speaking about like direction.
Mhm, mhm.
More
I'm not familiar enough about this field to say, but that would be super interesting. And I'm sure there's a continuity. I don't think that's necessarily a revolution in terms of being a disruption in the history of media. But I'm not an expert in that, so that would be interesting to investigate. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So we can stop that here. Thank you very much.
It's also great the size of the projection
Yeah, it's impressive.
compared to the resolution of your pictures. Talking